Good afternoon. My name is Don Racheter. I'm the president of Public Interest Institute, which is the state policy network affiliate for the state of Iowa. And it's the research arm of Iowans for Tax Relief, which is a division of National Taxpayers Union. I serve on the board of both National Taxpayers Union Foundation and Iowans for Tax Relief. And so it's appropriate that I'm going to talk to you about tax increment financing, which is the acronym TIF, to parallel Todd. And we're here in San Jose, and most of you, I think, are of an age where you remember the song by Dionne Warwick, "Do You Know the Way to San Jose?" And obviously, since we've all assembled here, we figured out the answer to the question of the way to. We've made it here. And so now we're discussing the way of San Jose. And from what I've heard so far at this conference, it appears that the way of San Jose is to stick it to renters, potential home buyers, commuters, the poor, the working class, and taxpayers in general. And TIF abuse is part of that project, as was demonstrated by the previous speaker, and the fact that San Jose is the second largest, has the second largest redevelopment indebtedness of any city in the state of California. We in Iowa have a lot of problems. One of the scholars that I'm going to cite in a few minutes thinks that Iowa is the worst in the country, and I'm sure in the Q&A you can disabuse me of that notion by giving me horror stories from wherever you're from. But I think we can all agree that TIF, while it may have started out as a noble idea, has certainly been perverted very quickly by the bureaucrats, the politicians, and the special interest. And it started out as a notion for redevelopment, urban redevelopment in blighted areas. In Iowa, its statutory authority is Chapter 403 of the Code, the Urban Renewal Law, and Chapters 260E and 260F for community colleges. There were major amendments to the chapter in 1994, and again in 95 and again in 96, and we'll return to those changes in a moment. The idea is that you have an area that's going downhill, or is downhill, blighted, and you want to prompt somebody to come in there and redevelop it, clean it up, make it habitable for people or for business or whatever, industry if possible, create jobs. And so the tax authority, usually the city, has the authority under the code to basically freeze the tax rate, and then as time passes and inflation and development create additional revenue, that is siphoned back directly to pay for the improvements. And so what you do is rob Peter to pay Paul. You take the money that would have gone to the community college district, to the school district, to the county for services and so on, and the city uses all of that to either create roads, create sewers, give money grants to developers to come in and do something. And so that increment above the base is what we're talking about as the TIF. Now the base is supposedly going on to the original taxing authorities that are part of this process, and so they're held harmless. They're not hurt. Of course, they don't get any revenue increase from the inflation, and they don't get the increment for the 10 years, 20 years, whatever the TIF district runs for. Now the idea is that because the development occurs, and the assumption is it wouldn't have occurred without the process of the TIF. Because the development occurs, the land values, the property values go up, and the taxes go up, and down the road when the TIF comes off, then everybody's going to get better off from the increased development. But there's a lot of problems between the plan and the reality, as we've seen over and over again in this conference. So that's how they set the thing up. And as I said, the special interests, the politicians and the bureaucrats all have an interest in keeping these things going once they get started. And so very quickly they changed from blight being the requirement to development being the aim. They very quickly turned from helping create manufacturing and jobs to allowing for housing. and they very quickly changed them from housing for the poor to housing for the rich. In fact, they had the classic camel's nose under the tent flap. In 95, they expanded this to allow for housing for the poor. In 96, less than a year later, they came back and said anybody. And of course, it turns out, as you'll see, that a lot of this development is for very upper income type of people. So they didn't even let one session of the legislature go by. We have biennial sessions in Iowa. So they started here, get the nose under the tent flap, it's for the downtrodden, we're going to do this wonderful thing. Next year they're back, nobody's looking, they change it, and ipso facto it goes into a high income development assistance program. So what's next? Are we going to TIF people's tool sheds? Well, one left critic of the process, former S3c Commissioner Nicholas Johnson, who's now an attorney in Iowa City, teaching as an adjunct at the University of Iowa Law School, wrote a piece called "Tiffing My Tool Shed" in September of 2006. And he said Coralville, which is the bedroom community of the University of Iowa and Iowa City, says Coralville, which is a town of about 10,000 people, has 19 active TIF districts. 19, count them. I'd say anyone who builds anything in Coralville and doesn't get his or her snout in the public trough and suck out enough to get the city's taxpayers to pay for it is a naive fool. Taxpayers pay the cost and developers keep the profit from selling multi-$100,000 condos to the wealthy. What a sweet deal. In Iowa City itself, they have more than 19 or 20 TIF districts, none of them for tool sheds. It prompted a 22-year-old student, Rod Sullivan, to write to the city council when they were considering giving a TIF grant to Hieronymus Partners, which wanted to develop a high-rise in beautiful downtown Iowa City. They put a grocery store on the first floor, which has gone bankrupt. They put high-rise condos in a hotel, Hotel Vitro. It's a very modern, avant-garde kind of hotel for the upper income users. And Mr. Sullivan was prompted in his objections to this process, trying to get the city council to overrule the recommendation of the Economic Development Committee. He said it's a deviation in policy. Historically, TIFs have been used here for development and not for housing, and especially not housing for people who don't meet low-income categories. It's unwise to offer inducements when none are necessary. Tax policies should be spent on public purposes. What is the public purpose of building a high-rise hotel and condos? Well, some people said it gives us more control if we have a TIF. And he says, well, what is the city council and the planning commission for? You can control these projects. You don't need TIF money as a carrot to do it. You've got the stick. And he says, finally, using TIF for residential units creates a problem for the rollback and the increment not going to other jurisdictions in the county that need this money for the sheriff's department, for the fire departments, and so on. He says, if anybody feels the market will bear this project, he or she should try to convince his or her financiers of the merits. It is not the job of the city to help one landlord at the expense of all the rest. So you start to see the drift of what the problem with TIF is. It's picking winners and losers. The politically well-connected get the TIFs, and the rest of us pay the freight for their projects, even though these people are multi-million-dollar developers. If you look at the cartoon that's in this handout we got this earlier in the session, on page 7, it shows a guy that says, "Eat hearty, boys, plenty more where this came from," and it shows 3 grinning guys who represent favored developers, bond brokers, attorneys, and consultants, and meanwhile the police, the libraries, and the schools are getting a bone thrown to them at the side. And that really is a real essence of the real problem with TIF abuse that we have in our system. Well, less facetiously than who's tiffing their tool shed, as Sullivan points out, there's a lot of problems with this. It's been critiqued from the left, from the right, from the center. For example, my colleagues, loosely calling them that, in the Iowa Policy Project, this is the outfit that's on the polar opposite of what Public Interest Institute stands for. They're always critiquing everything that we do. And it's run by a former state rep who lives in a converted chicken coop, a very green kind of guy. And then his name is Fisher, and there's a guy named Bruner who's at the Child and Family Policy Center. And these guys did a little investigation of one of the TIF projects that occurred in eastern Iowa. Muscatine County did a TIF for something called IPSCO Steel. And these guys went to court and challenged it and put the representatives of the company under oath, and they asked them, if you didn't get this TIF, would you build the steel plant anyway? And they answered truthfully, well, yeah, we are going to do it anyway. But, you know, if there's a trough to line up at, we're going to do it. We're not stupid. So they conclude there's a high likelihood that TIFs are overused at considerable expense to taxpayers. Now, generally, these guys don't worry about taxpayers, but this is one of the cases where they use that language. And there is a very small window where taxpayers, citizens can protest these TIFs, but it's 10 days. And the public notice requirements are so minimal as to be non-existent, and so people hardly ever know that they have the right to challenge these TIF projects as they're coming forward. So Fisher and Bruner conclude such lack of accountability is a formula for fiscal irresponsibility. And they go on to list a whole series of reforms that they think are needed to ensure that TIFs have a public purpose, they're not overused, they're accountable, and they actually contribute to development rather than just transferring resources from low-income and moderate-income taxpayers to well-developed or well-resourced developers. Now on the right, we have the Iowa Farm Bureau. They have provided a bill, model legislation, that they got one of their members, who's a member of the legislature, to introduce recently. This is from the Ames Tribune. Maggie Helfrey was investigating this in 2003. There was a program called Stir Iowa, which called for the elimination of all TIFs. Phase them out, don't have any more, bad idea, let's get rid of them. Might have had a good purpose once upon a time, it's been so perverted, we just got to throw it out. And one of the criticisms was it's been shifted from creating base to housing, and high-income housing at that. In the center, a couple of academic critics based at the Iowa State University Department of Economics, David Swenson and Liesl Ethington, have published a couple of pieces, one in June of 2002 entitled, "Do Tax Increment Finance Districts in Iowa Spur Regional Economic and Demographic Growth?" The short answer is no. And another one in April of 2006, Tax Increment Financing Growth in Iowa. And I'll get to that in just a second. A couple of points here. They say, the evidence we have analyzed suggests the net positions are not being enhanced, that the overall expected benefits do not exceed the public's costs. They conclude there is indirect statistical evidence that this profligate practice is resulting in a direct transfer of resources from existing taxpayers to new firms, without yielding region-wide economic and social gains to justify public investment. Now, from the time they did the first piece to the time they did the second piece, these things have about exploded because other people are figuring out what a gravy train it is. And of course, you've got this whole problem of low-income people who are paying the freight, who don't follow these developments, but people who are in the business have attorneys and they have CPAs and they have other people to tell them about these opportunities for sucking in resources to add to their bottom line. So in the 2006 edition, they say in fiscal 91 there were 746 TIF districts or projects in the state of Iowa. By fiscal 97, that had increased to 1,014. And by fiscal 2006, the time of their their project, their report here, it had mushroomed to 2,358, or 133% increase in the number of TIF projects in the state in a 9-year period. So not only have we got abuse, but we've got rapidly increasing abuse, and that's one of the reasons why my shop is looking at this to try to come up with some suggestions about what needs to go forward. And it's a candidate for a left-right coalition because of these critical remarks by people on the other side. Now here's where some of you may take exception, but Svensson and Earthington say, it is widely considered by researchers studying this topic that Iowa has one of the most lenient and lucrative statutes for TIF usage in the U.S. First, Iowa TIF users are not required to negotiate the use of the increments with the other governments involved. They are simply declared and spent unilaterally, mostly by the cities, at the expense of the counties, the school districts, the community colleges, etc. Second, Iowa is a property tax dependent and comparatively property rich state. Some of you, if you've ever taken geography lessons, know that there's 2 areas in the world that have the best possible soil for growing crops. One in the breadbasket of the Ural area in Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and the other is right down through Iowa. And you know, corn just jumps out of the field. You can hear it growing on a summer day, and you know, it's tremendous property, and it has a tremendous property value that's then subject to these taxes. So third, there are virtually no effective state or local oversight mechanisms of TIF's usage by anybody in the state of Iowa. So, not surprisingly, TIF has become one of the chief economic development tools for many, and the now familiar conclusion that many of the breaks go to people who don't really need them. Now, if you thought it was bad, you haven't heard the worst of it yet. Remember I said that the idea was that you do the project, the property becomes more valuable, so there's increased opportunity to tax this new higher value property. Well, what happens if you put a non-taxable entity on this development? Like maybe a park, or a fire station, or a library, that's not going to be taxable once you build it. It's going to go off the tax rolls. Well, yeah, you got it. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. In their nice academic way, Svensson and Earthington say, TIF increments are generally thought improperly used when applied to general public buildings, fire stations, libraries, parks, and other recreational spending, general community roadway or other basic community infrastructure, or broad general government services. Yet there are many examples of TIF revenues in Iowa cities used for these purposes. One is left to wonder whether the restrictive language in the original and amended authority in the Constitution for TIFs in Iowa has become void because it is currently and widely ignored by the cities who are using it as their tool. So why is it occurring? And why do the planners continue to tout the use of TIFs? How do they claim that it's a successful program given all of this research which points out the difficulties? Well, much if not all of the incremental growth in these communities is a relocation of growth from deteriorating Main Street areas out to benefited zones on the outskirts of towns. The TIF district gains, the general tax base shrinks, the relocated firm gets a tax break. The cities claim they have retained the business and count this as a success. But the city, school, and county general tax rates have to go up to cover the costs no longer borne by the relocated firm. And regionally, there has been no job or income growth as a result of the process. So the big boxes, the Costco's, the Walmarts, the Kias or whatever, more likely to be Shield All Sports or something in our neck of the woods, Cabrera Fishing and Hunting rather than a Kia, but you get the drift that these people are making out. They would have built the stuff anyway, and it's a shift and it's a subsidy and it's not a very good, good result for the taxpayers. or the citizens of the community. Well, what should we conclude from this very brief overview of the recitation of TIF abuse in Iowa and California and elsewhere in our world? Well, my conclusion personally is that we need to teach and preach against this abuse. We need to get the word out through conferences like this, through our publications, through letters to the editor, and particularly through the internet, which is a wonderful tool that the Main Street media can't use to block us from talking to each other. And ideally, that information will build a head of steam and start a protest against the abuse of TIFs, the abuse of what started as a good idea. But unfortunately, I've been teaching and preaching against this for at least the last 20 years as a professor in college courses, as well as doing this think tank business on the side, nights and weekends. And you don't see any firestorm coming out of Iowa that you've read about in the media. So perhaps it's just a testimony to my lack of eloquence. But I suspect it's more a function of what I call the democratic paradox, and which was referred to by one of our previous speakers as the collective action problem. You know, you think that in a democracy, the majority rules. I mean, that's what the Greek root words mean, democracy, rule of the people, and majority rule. So the thing that the Founding Fathers were worried about was tyranny of the majority. That's right. The Baptists and the Catholics would take away the church property of the Dutch Reformed people there in Pella, and that would be a problem because they didn't have enough people to stop them from doing that. Well, that hasn't been what has really been the problem. Because in our system we allow people to vote and to organize and speak and petition for redress of grievance, you have a situation where with concentrated benefits and diffused costs, the organized minority is able to expropriate resources from the unorganized majority. For example, if you have a shoe salesman or a shoe firm that's building and selling shoes that cost $50 a piece domestically, and you can import them from Italy with a designer logo on for 48 bucks a pair, including shipping and handling and so on, and you go down to the store and they're identical shoes, one's 48 and one's 50, most people are going to buy the $48 shoe. So the shoe manufacturers and the labor unions of the people that work in the shoe store are going to go to the legislature and lobby for a $4 tax or tariff or whatever you want to call it, so that the Italian shoe is going to be 52, the domestic shoe is going to be 50, people are going to go down and buy the domestic shoe. But if everybody buys a pair of shoes once a year and you're wasting $2 more than you had to, that creates a big pot of money which then can be given in political action committees to the legislators who pass the legislation, who continue the legislation, to allow you to have that advantage as the firm that's domestic and who has all of those voters in the voting block in the union who's going to support you come election time. And because of the rational ignorance effect, the average citizen isn't going to know he got screwed over for $2 a pair of shoes per year. And even if he figured it out, because some of us told him in our issue briefs or our talks or our televised CDs or whatever, is it worth it for them to give a campaign contribution of thousands of dollars like the organized interests are to the legislators to save $2 a year? No, that's not rational. That's not the way that the world works, because the benefits are concentrated among a few manufacturers and a few union members, but the costs are diffused over all of the shoe buyers in the whole society. It doesn't make sense. The scales are tipped continually in favor of productive interests rather than consumptive interests. And so we've got a real big boulder to roll up the hill as sponsors and supporters of taxpayers and consumers and transport people. Sir.
I'm sorry, or I'm embarrassed to admit my ignorance, but the TIF that we're discussing here, the tax incremental financing, locks in the tax rate at the onset of the project,
right,
before the project begins.
Right.
How does that benefit accrue to the developer?
Because The money is taken by the city, and they pay for putting in the money that is in the increment of increase as the years go by, as the TIF district continues.
Up front, no dollars.
No dollars up front.
Okay.
But after the first year, there's money. And the city plows it back into putting new streets into the development.
And the money comes from increased taxes paid on the newly developed property.
Siphoned off of what would have gone to the school district.
But the developer's already out of the project.
Wait. They can put it into infrastructure, but they can also give it to the developer and have the developer put his own roads and streets in. So the taxpayers are paying for what normally a developer would pay if he didn't have this TIF project to put in a
So
subdivision.
you're saying that the money that would have otherwise gone for whatever the taxes go for, this,
Schools, libraries, police, fire.
anything over and above a certain
I
ground
want to get
level
I want to
amount
get another
is
speaker
given
in
back.
here,
Okay.
and we can get back to that.
Okay.
But can you
Well, thank
kind of
you.
wrap it up
Yes.
2 more minutes,
You bet.
and then we'll have questions for everybody afterwards.
So this rational ignorance effect, this collective action problem, it creates a real big boulder for us to roll up the hill. But it certainly doesn't mitigate against us trying to get the word out about these difficulties and these problems, because there have been changes that have started from little sparks and little social movements, and people don't like being had. I don't like having a guy who's a millionaire build a hotel in the downtown area of my city, and I'm helping to pay for it. And I'm never going to use that facility. I mean, the room rate is exorbitant. I went down when they had the open house and looked at the rooms. It's not something I'd want to stay in. And so why should I be paying for it? So I'll pass the baton.
Good, thank you.